Good, only 5 minutes late, so I think we're going to be able to get us back on track here. And again, we're transitioning a little bit, and we heard some fantastic presentations this morning really about the state of the ecosystems and some of the critical elements of ecosystems. So I think we have kind of, sorry to misuse a word, baseline, for kind of digging down a little bit deeper into some issues. And this is one I know that's on a lot of folks' mind because it came up in some of Sarah's presentation this morning about really thinking about the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, really thinking about how do we manage and collaborate with the fisheries industries around the impacts of offshore wind. So there's a unique effort that we'll hear a little bit more detailed from today. So we have three panelists, a moderator and panelists, Kris Ohleth. She's the director of the Special Initiative for Offshore Wind, and everything about what they do is special, so she'll elaborate on that just a little bit. And again, we're really grateful as well to have Jane Rosenblatt Birkhofer, she's the Deputy Commissioner for NJDEP, and Ursula Howson from BOEM, because they've been partners on this project. So with that, I'll just turn it right over to Kris, and I assume you just will stay there and present from the table. Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks all for your interest in this topic, and Tony and the Marco team for coordinating such a great conversation. These symposium are always so excellent, so thanks all for being here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about offshore wind, everyone's favorite ocean topic, which I know dominates so much of our work, being the kind of new kid to the offshore ocean block. The concept that I want to just outline briefly before I introduce the panelists is this idea of regional fisheries compensation from potential offshore wind impacts. So, as you may imagine, when an offshore wind farm is built, there's a lot of existing ocean users out there in the busy ocean, and they will be impacted from offshore wind development. The first, the first goal in the NEPA hierarchy is to avoid potential impacts to existing ocean users, and that's typically done in the siting process, which is handled by BOEM, and maybe Ursula will talk a little bit about that. And then the second stage would be to minimize potential impacts to that existing ocean user. And then if those two cannot be, really fully avoiding all impacts to that ocean user, there's an opportunity for mitigation. One of those mitigation measures is financial compensation. And so far, there are 3 wind farm projects that are offering financial compensation to the fishing community. Those projects are the Revolution Wind Project, the South Fork Wind Farm, and the why am I blanking? Yeah, Vineyard Wind, of course, project. All those projects are in construction and or operation, some phase of construction or operation, and they all have very different models for compensation. And when the states started to recognize how each one of these projects was essentially worked on by the developer, the compensation framework, recognizing how different each one of these 3 programs was, the states very wisely said, the East Coast states, we really need to put together a regional compensatory mitigation framework so that it would create a bit of a one-stop shop for the fishing community. This would help create efficiency, equity, transparency for the fishing community to be able just to go to one third-party independent regional fund administrator and put in their claim for whatever financial compensation they felt they were due. The claims administrator could review that claim and then verify it and then pay out on that claim. So that is the program that 11 East Coast states from Maine to North Carolina started to undertake over 3 years ago now, right, Jane? So it's been some time. And I won't go into full details on it because I think we'll kind of get to it in the panel, but just wanted you to be aware of kind of the setup, the why the states felt this was important, and then fortunately federal partners also participating in this framework. So my entity, the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, has had the pleasure of doing the convening and facilitation of this group of 11 states, the fishing community, and offshore wind developers in this joint effort. So without further ado, I'll move to Ursula for her introduction.
Hi, thanks, Kris. So a quick introduction about me. My name is Ursula Howson. I currently work for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. I am in our policy shop, which is at our headquarters, so I'm looking at nationwide issues as well as some Atlantic projects. Before I came into the policy shop, I was a fisheries biologist in the weeds with fisheries compensation, working with stakeholders, developing the analyses for the revenue exposure that we use in our NEPA documents. Before that, I actually used to work at Monmouth University, and I also worked at NOAA for a while. So the role that I have now is, as Kris was alluding to, working somewhat with the 11 states initiative to develop this regional fund. BOEM, of course, as a federal agency, needs to kind of take a step back from that process, so we're there in an advisory role. We have economists who we work with who can evaluate any of the, to ensure the consistency or that the regional fund will adhere to the requirements that we have in our terms and conditions of COP approval. But again, BOEM is really in an advisory role. What else should I think that was it.
Yeah, we'll get to more.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, and actually, the one other item I wanted to mention is the terms and conditions. We'll talk about that a lot. Terms and conditions of COP approval is where currently BOEM has most of our teeth, where we can set those requirements for compensatory mitigation, and that's based on the revenue exposure analyses that we do in our NEPA documents. Our NEPA documents, National Environmental Policy Act, analyses on the conditions or the construction and operation plan. We'll talk about a COP, construction and operation plan. We talk about COP approval, which is essentially the permit for the construction and operation plan. We talk about the terms and conditions, which are, again, where our teeth are in terms of making sure that the lessee adheres to these requirements. And we may also talk a little bit about bidding credits, but we'll get into that later. Jane, over to you.
Thanks. So Jane Rosenblatt, now Birkhofer, for those of you who have known me for quite some time, and I was reflecting on my way in, Kris, that we've been working on this. I've gotten married, I've had a baby, I'm back from maternity leave, so it's been a long time in the making. And I serve as Deputy Commissioner at the Department of Environmental Protection here in New Jersey. Before that, I was Chief of Staff, and then before that, I was Deputy Chief of Staff. All of that time, it's been 6 going into 7 years now through the Ed Murphy administration. And through that time, I've had offshore wind as part of my policy portfolio in those different roles. So I work very closely with Joe Cimino, our Administrator of Marine Fisheries Administration, Kevin Hassel, who's here today. Kevin, raise your hand and wave. From our Coastal Zone Management Program. As well as Megan Brunati, who's now our Chief of Staff at the department, who's been with the department for 25 plus years. So, yeah, I think from the very beginning, Kris, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts have taken a leadership role in bringing the now 11 states together, and we're thrilled to be where we are, though it's been a labor of love and certainly a lot of 8 a.m. Wednesday morning phone calls that we kvetch on in so many words. But we're looking forward to the next phase of this. I'm hoping that we can share, the current status of where we are in development today and get into any questions that the audience may have about it, especially from the state's role. We're I remember sitting one of my first weeks at the department, sitting down with Debbie Mans, who was then Deputy Commissioner, and talking about how we were going to handle fisheries compensation. And we thought we were going to be on an island by ourselves, figuring out how to negotiate with what was then our first project in Ørsted and Ocean Wind 1. And, we did not anticipate that there was going to be this kind of 11 states initiative, but certainly tackling it together with the other states, with the developers, with the fishing industry has been a much more beneficial process and program ultimately developed that's going to lead to something more equitable for everyone. So we're thrilled to be part of this, taking a leadership role, and looking forward to talking about it today.
Yeah, thanks, Jane, and please do queue up those questions. Don't all run to the mic at once, but we would love to also get your questions as well. And, I think it's, been, really interesting, and I think we're preaching to the choir here, because this is an example of multi-state collaboration really coming into practice and working. And, obviously the good team at Marco and all you here, I'm sure, espouse that idea, but really great to see the 11 states working together on something that is, really so practical and needed. And, I've been working in offshore wind for too long now, I'll tell you. And one of the first questions fishermen would always ask is, how will I be compensated? And it felt like until we can answer that question, recognizing that certainly the fishing community is, it's a much bigger picture. It's a lifestyle, it's a history, it's a culture for the fishing community. But at the very bare minimum, if we can't explain to them how they can be financially made whole, then we really can't have the higher order conversation about coexistence and opportunities to figure out how resiliency and adaptation can fit into this framework, which is a whole nother panel that maybe we can do next year. But speaking of those stakeholders, I guess I'll start with you, Jane, and just hear a little bit about how the state of New Jersey is approaching including the fishing community and their voices, whether it's through this regional fund process or more broadly with respect to offshore wind.
Sure. So through this process, and Kris, you could probably speak about this much more eloquently than I can. So jump in when you need to correct me. But we, from the very beginning, have engaged with fishing industry representatives up and down the coast, not necessarily specifically from New Jersey, from my perspective, but to bring them, bring them along is not correct, but like to engage in a deep and meaningful way about how we're going to approach this. So it's not been state-led, it's been state-led in that we've been the convening mechanism in many ways, but we've really been taking our cues in a collaborative way for how this can work best for the fishing industry themselves, because ultimately they're the end user, right? And what we want to be able to do is provide, as you said, a mechanism that there isn't, for however many lease areas there is up and down the coast, there isn't that many different applications that need to be filled out. There isn't that many different set of rules. There isn't that many different sets of documentation that needs to be provided. And so creating something that not only is equitable in distribution and in applicability and in eligibility, but something that's easy to use is first and foremost what our priorities are. So in more recent time, we've been directly engaging with folks, what we've been calling fish advisors. I'm not sure how they feel about that title, but we could come up with something better. And bringing them in to advise on the development, let's say this, bringing them in and sitting on the selection panel for the regional fund administrator and how it's going to be how it was selected, yet to be announced. NYSERDA ran a procurement process to bring an administrator to design the actual fund, and we had fishing industry representatives on that selection panel. So bringing them into the decision making, bringing them along in that process, and seeing transparently how we're making the decisions along the way. And then moving forward, there'll be a design oversight committee, the DOC, as we are lovingly calling it, and there's representatives from the fishing industry from up and down the coast again, that will be sitting, working with the state representatives, working with the developers, the offshore wind developers, to design the actual fund itself and how it gets administered. So we're trying to walk the walk, talk the talk as much as we can, to bring people into the decision-making process so that they can see themselves reflected in the ultimate end product.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to describe it. And, that kind of genuine involvement, I think, as opposed to just kind of the check-the-box exercise. Really been impressed to see how the states have done that. And Ursula, love to hear a little bit more about how BOEM has been engaged on this. Maybe talk a little bit about your draft guidance on compensation and how you've involved stakeholders in that process.
Yeah, thanks, Kris. So we have, over the years, engaged with stakeholders. First, probably about 10 years ago, some of my colleagues had led workshops across the Northeast to start talking to stakeholders. We also have public meetings where stakeholders, fisheries stakeholders and other stakeholders can provide their opinions, their comments on specific projects. But what we also developed was a set of guidelines for compensatory mitigation. And so we developed those guidelines in 21, 22. We put those out for public comment and review, got them back working on the comments and so on, addressing them, making a lot of changes to the document, and then realized that we really needed to engage tribes, so federally recognized tribes. So we spent quite a while engaging with tribes and going actually across the country, ensuring that we had, because this is of national scope, these guidelines, so engaging with stakeholders as well as separately with tribes across the country, and developing those, editing and continuing to edit those guidelines. We are anticipating that they will be finished by the end of this year. So it's been a long road, but part of that road was also that public engagement, engaging with the stakeholders and making sure that concerns were addressed. One thing that we did note, this was especially true for the West Coast as well as for Gulf of Maine, is that many folks, including many tribes, are really concerned about floating wind. We don't see that much, we don't see that at all right now in the mid-Atlantic. As we move farther offshore towards the shelf with the Central Atlantic leases that are being offered soon, we may start seeing floating wind, but that is really the only option for West Coast and Gulf of Maine leases. So for now, what we've decided to do, rather than holding the guidelines that we've been working on for 2 years that we really want to publish, we're going to publish those, acknowledging that floating wind is an issue and is a separate kind of entity. We really need to evaluate the technology. We need to evaluate the potential impacts and really evaluate what that looks like, floating wind looks like in conjunction with fishing. What does that mean to fishers and their compensation and mitigation? So we're publishing the guidelines without the floating wind. They are living guidelines, and they will be updated when we can get more information about floating wind and can address it properly and update them.
Yeah, it's a great point. And just to be clear, the program that the states are working on, these 11 states, will apply to any fishing community member on the East Coast, and that would be either commercial fishing or what is called recreational for hire fishing, so not private angling per se. That would be hard to compensate for. But in terms of the for hire fishing community, charter boat captains and those who can also demonstrate impacts, I think, you know, on the recreational for hire side, what we've seen with offshore wind is that the impacts would be quite different. That insofar as to even say that the recreational community has been supportive of offshore wind in ways where they recognize the reef structure that will be created and, you know, the additional potential attraction and biomass. And, you know, all the fishermen out there know, right, go fish at the bridge piling or, you know, go fish at the oil platform. So these will be many structures out there that the fishing community will be attracted to. There will be changes to access, certainly during construction and other ways. So recognizing that charter boat captains will have impacts, this will also apply to the recreational for hire community. NOAA has estimated in their exposure data that it's typically 5 to 10% of the total exposure in terms of financial impact to the fishing community on the rec side. So, you know, you can see it's quite a much smaller potential impact, but certainly one that's still there and one that's recognized. So I think, you know, it would be helpful, Ursula, also if you could explain a little bit about NOAA's exposure data, what that means, the anticipated role that NOAA could play in this program. Maybe Jane, if you want to vamp on that as well, because, you know, I think the support of the federal family is something that has been really important in this program to date.
Okay, yep. So NOAA plays an advisory role with the 11 States Commission, much as BOEM does, as federal agencies. But in terms of the data that they provide, so if you happen to look at our environmental impact statements, there's, you know, very complex analyses of the impacts of offshore wind on fishers. Some of that we call revenue exposure, and it's an estimate of what could be the potential losses to commercial fishing and for hire recreational fishing due to offshore wind, so in a specific lease area. And so we get those numbers, those data from NOAA. They have a website where it's actually publicly available. If you're interested, it's socioeconomics Socioeconomics of offshore wind, I think you could just Google that and NOAA, and you can find the website, and it's specific for each lease area. And we work hand in hand with NOAA to provide them updates to our lease areas. We've worked with them probably the last 5 or 6 years to identify what types of analyses are most appropriate to include in our environmental impact statements. And again, they give us the data, and then we take those data and then do our analyses in the NEPA documents. NOAA also plays a very, very important role as a cooperating agency for all of our environmental impact statements. So they are working with us to ensure that our documents are suitable and appropriate and accurate analyses.
Jane, on that thread, not sure if folks saw the news this morning, in fact, but breaking offshore wind news, that the Atlantic Shores projects, they have what's called a construction and operation plan, which Ursula had mentioned earlier, and that just received its final approval from the Bureau this morning. So that's a big kind of milestone for that project. So Jane, from the state's perspective, just, kind of curious, your interactions with Atlantic Shores, and this is essentially the project that would be sited from like LBI to Atlantic City, more or less, off the coast of that area. So it's the furthest project along for the state of New Jersey. Talk a little bit about fishing compensation and that experience.
Yeah, so as the state, I don't have to tell this audience, but as the state regulators, we're ensuring that the project itself, both onshore and offshore impacts, are minimized, avoided, minimized, and then mitigated for. And so as part of our state permit issuance and CZM approval, we've agreed with Atlantic Shores through a letter of intent to enter into an MOU to negotiate a compensation package. And I just laugh because it's so much process and paperwork. But we have to document and formalize everything that we can. And so we'll be working with Atlantic Shores over the coming months to develop what a compensation package looks like, and they've agreed also to use this regional compensation fund. So we're excited about that, and of course, in the interim, we'd recognize that since it's not established yet, and we want to make sure that there is compensation available for the fishing community when it's needed, that there may need to be some kind of interim mechanism before the fund is established. But we're looking forward to working on it with Atlantic Shores, and certainly the department has been working with them on the development and design of their project to minimize impacts for years now. So it's been an ongoing and iterative process, and we're looking forward to the next phase of it.
Yeah, thank you. And really the, the opportunity, timing is everything, right? So the current status of the regional fund administrator, as Jane alluded to, is the selection process for that third-party entity is just wrapping up, and we would expect that New York State, who is the procuring agent in this case, to be making a press release, hopefully in the next couple months, announcing who that regional fund administrator is. But we kind of have these two timelines going on. We have the opportunity to select the regional fund administrator, but at the same time, offshore wind projects continue to move on and maybe outside of this regional fund administrator scope. So trying to figure out how we can dovetail those as appropriate as they continue to come online, and again, create these efficiencies for the fishing community being able to apply to a one-stop shop. I will have to say it's been super interesting because like sometimes a commercial will come on like, did you use talcum powder between the years of 2010 and 2014? Did you develop ovarian cancer? Do you know the commercials I'm talking about? Well, these are claims administrators. I've had to learn a whole new language and get to know a whole new group of people who are super interesting. So they can share all kinds of stories about NFL concussions and PG&E wildfires and the kind of things that are compensated for that unfortunately are nothing like offshore wind, because offshore wind is not a disaster. But it's still this really interesting approach where we're taking a claims administrator, bringing them in to do a claims model. Notably, this is the first and only claims compensation plan that is being done proactively. Every administrator that we approached in the country and we approached many dozens, said, wow, we've never done this when there's not a court order. Every time it's always mandated. And so I think the claims administrators have found it really interesting to say, wow, we get the opportunity to work with stakeholders and craft something that really works for them, as opposed to calling, 1-800 talcum powder and putting in your claim, right? So you get a chance to actually develop the eligibility requirements and have that type of participation, so.
Just to build on that,
Yeah, go
Kris, I
ahead.
do think that while it's just the 11 states, I'm saying just the 11 states on the East Coast right now, I do think that when we are successful, because we will be, it could become a national model for how the other states handle this. And so while it is taking a long time, we're trying to be as deliberate as possible and working with our national federal partners to make sure that the guidance that's being issued, that it's, while specific to the East Coast, is applicable nationwide. So we're trying to set a model here that can be, if the West Coast wants to take this up between their implicated states, or if the program itself becomes national, I think that's something in the back of our minds too as we're developing this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the states are doing a great job on the East Coast. We know that in the Gulf of Mexico and on the West Coast, they're already looking at ways to build compensation frameworks. So, bravo to the states on the East Coast. One thing I think we want to be clear on is, who pays the compensation. And just so that's clear, it's always the offshore wind developers. Whether that's through the NEPA process that Ursula explained earlier, or another potential way of paying, getting money into that fund, and maybe you've kind of heard about this if you've been involved in these circles, is through either like bidding credits in the leasing process. So, the way it works is that BOEM is, they manage the OCS, and there'll be a leasing auction, and developers will, put in a bid, and as part of that bid, they can get credits, a bidding credit for different types of programs that BOEM wants to incentivize. So I don't know if Ursula, you want to talk a little bit about, bidding credits in general, because I think it's super interesting, and how this would apply to this program.
Sure. So it's kind of a complicated process, but essentially a bidding credit, well, let me back up. Any monies that come in from a lease go directly to the Treasury. They don't come to BOEM. They don't go to any other agency. Federal agencies work on procurement from Congress, so we don't get money from the Treasury. So all of that money goes into the Treasury. And I know there is, I believe for oil and gas, there's a carve back from states. So Gulf states, I think, can carve back some of that money. So we looked at that model and determined that for offshore wind, what would work is something called bidding credits. So the developer can submit ideas or plans for certain types of contracts or certain types of development programs. For instance, for workforce development, for community benefits, things like that. And we felt that fisheries compensation was one that would be very, very useful to get that started way back early in the process, right when the lease is being developed. So we've developed a bidding credit for fisheries compensation. And the way it works, we can only max out to 25% of an overall bid. And what the lessee does, they still have to pay that money, but the money, up to 25% of the entire lease value. So for instance, I think the least expensive lease that we sold recently, or that was leased recently, was Central Atlantic. It was $17 million. That pales in comparison to the multi-billion-dollar leases from New York Bight from a few years ago. But 25% of that, the lessee, rather than paying into the Treasury, can use that money for other programs. As I said, one of those programs that has been developed for certain leases for Central Atlantic, for Gulf of Maine, Gulf of Mexico, is for fisheries compensation. However, the rules are different than for our terms and conditions at the end of the process that I mentioned earlier, and they are dictated by the Miscellaneous Receipts Act, which says that we can't direct where the money goes. what they can do, what the developers can do, is submit a plan to us. We can approve that plan, and then they determine through that plan where those monies go. But part of that, if they can put that money into a fund, potentially provide that money to the regional fund. They can't use it for startup costs, but they can use it kind of as a base, right? They can put money in to get the fund started. They can't just use it for administrative costs. They can then use that money to offset any expenditures that would be required later once the actual analyses have been done to determine what the impacts would be. And again, it's kind of complicated because you have to know the whole process, but leasing is way back here and environmental analysis is way up here. And so they are seeding the pot down here, but the environmental analyses don't happen until here, and they actually have to spend a lot of that money right around here too. So it's a little strange and challenging, I think, in terms of negotiating that timeline.
Yeah, thanks for that that update. Really interesting. And for those who are interested in this and a topic we certainly also wanted to cover, in the final sale notice, which essentially sets out how these bidding credits could be applied for the Gulf of Maine that was recently released, there was as part of the fisheries compensation for tribal subsistence fishing. And I know that Marco, certainly has deep engagement with the tribal communities and such, and so we wanted to, I think cover, Ursula from BOEM's perspective and Jane et al. From the state's perspective. We don't have as much engagement in the Mid-Atlantic as maybe in the Northeast, but your perspective on tribal feedback and what kind of experiences you've heard on compensation to date.
Right, thanks. And what Kris mentioned about this, it's essentially a carve-out specifically for tribal subsistence fishing, and that was a direct result of our conversations with Gulf of Maine tribes. And they were able to show us, they were able to quantify impacts that or quantify their subsistence fishing and how offshore wind could potentially impact that subsistence fishing. And that's the first time we'd actually ever seen quantification of, this is the haul that's coming in, or these are the fish that are coming in through this tribal-owned vessel. It's a commercial vessel. They take the fish and the lobster that are coming in. They sell some of it off to pay for the upkeep of the boat. The rest of it they distribute to the tribe. Not the money, but the actual fish and lobster and all that. And it's very, very important, especially for elders in the tribe. And actually having that information, and we only got that going and meeting with the tribe. So we went up to Maine, a group of us went up for what's called a G2G, or government-to-government meeting, with the tribe up there, and had this conversation with them. And we've been going back to these tribes and actually physically meeting with them. And there's a lot to be said. Virtual is one thing, email is one thing, but face-to-face is just essential. So that's how we found out that information, and that directly led to that part of the bidding credit that talks about subsistence fishing.
Yeah, super interesting. It looks like we're within the 10-minute mark to finish off, so please do queue up for questions. From the panelists, I would like to hear, your perspectives as, we think about, announcing who the regional fund administrator will be. There'll be 18 to 24 months or so of designing and standing the fund up before anyone can apply for compensation. So kind of looking ahead, what do you see, starting with you, Jane, what some of the biggest challenges will be in getting the fund stood up and available for claims?
Well, I think you mentioned the timeline. I think that'll be the biggest issue for us, especially with Atlantic Shores on the timeline that it is now, given the announcement today of its approval. I think that for New Jersey, at least, that interim step of how we're going to handle any necessary claims that need to be made between now and that 18 to 24 months. That's our own problem in many ways with Atlantic Shores. We'll have to figure that out. For the broader initiative, the biggest challenge, I really think that we have done an incredible job of building such trust amongst our stakeholders that when challenges have been met, we've been able to resolve them thus far. So I do think that we're in a good place to move forward quickly, but of course there's going to be disagreement and conflict, and thank God for you and Pat Field, who is our convener extraordinaire, who works day in and day out for on conflict resolution. I think we're just grateful to have you and him on the team that can help us navigate any of those challenges that the disparate stakeholders have through the process.
Yeah, timeline will definitely be an issue, and multiple states are kind of experiencing that challenge of, U.S. wind in Maryland getting approved, or Sunrise Wind off New York. Many projects are moving forward in multiple states having those challenges. Ursula, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I do, thanks. And actually, timeline is an issue from the federal perspective. As I mentioned before, we have these terms and conditions where anything that's not fulfilled with the state agreement, they still need to establish a fund to pay out the rest of what our analyses show. So say our analyses show there should be $2 million and a state negotiates $1 million, they still need to fulfill that other $1 million or make sure that other $1 million is available for claims. So, but we have different requirements. So we have a year, from COP approval to when that fund needs to be established. So what we're trying to do now is, again, it's very much getting into the weeds of how can we make it happen so that everyone that we've talked to, developers, the stakeholders, the federal agencies, really recognize the importance of this regional fund. How can we make that happen when the federal agencies are, we are governed by one set of rules and the states have different timelines. So there are different processes that we can follow to make that happen. It's just making it happen. That's the challenge.
Yeah, and thankfully
But
we
we'll
have
rise to
good
it.
partners, so.
We do have a question over here.
Thank you. Years ago, when the South Fork Wind was just a name and not
Glimmer,
anything in
yeah.
existence, it was going to be built by Ørsted at that time. And they had all kinds of meetings with people on the South Fork. And a small community, a very wealthy community where the cable was going to come in, organized to oppose it, and they had a whole lot of money. And then another group formed to support it and formed an organization called Win with Wind. And it had some town officials and a bunch of other people to combat the anti-organization because of the cable. And I was just wondering, this was the first one, I guess, of this whole bunch that's being built. Have there been any community, either anti or support groups after that? Or has it sort of gotten accepted as it's not going to poison or radiate or, all the people and kill your neighborhood?
No, there's definitely no opposition to offshore wind anymore. Yeah, that's pretty much wrapped up. Well, in fact, I can let you know at 6:30 tonight, there's actually going to be a great hearing that the BPU is hosting about what's called pre-built infrastructure, and recognizing the challenges of the transmission, which is, certainly we could do a day on that, but, the land-based, those cables making landfall need a place to go. And so the BPU in New Jersey, the Board of Public Utilities, with a lot of foresight, really, created this program called the pre-built infrastructure, which would allow the kind of shoreside cabling to be prepared to accept a collection of offshore wind farms. And there is, there has been a group that has been very actively opposing that, as well as here the Atlantic Shores project. So, there are that, and then, we have, many other folks supporting. So I think it's, it continues to be an evolution, and we're doing our best to get the best information out and involve all those stakeholders who do have concerns, like the fishing community. So, thanks for the question. Yes, Captain.
How do you actually calculate compensation for fishermen that lose access to an area?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how do you calculate the amount of compensation to a fisherman who loses access to the area? This is something that will be determined in the design and development phase, and this is why we have the Design Oversight Committee, who will be the fishing community members, the offshore wind developers, and the states, all giving input to the regional fund administrator. So, we can really figure out a fair way. BOEM has done some preliminary, calculations on, what type of disruptions fishermen could experience, that presuming some adaptations in the fishing community, how they would be eventually able to get into that wind farm area once it's operational. TBD, I guess, is the short answer. Right now, if you look at the program for Vineyard Wind, all you need to do is say that you fished in that area in the past 5 years, and you can use VMS, VTR, AIS data to show that. For the South Fork project, you actually do need to have like tax records and things that are a little more elaborate. So we're really going to try to find a way, I think, that balances the ease of use for the applicant versus, reducing fraud and ensuring that the monies that are delivered are, legitimate. So, yes, question, one more, thank you.
So this might have been answered by that question, but it's my understanding that different fisheries are more data rich and others are more data poor. And so as you're coming up with these decisions, and we talked a lot today about baselines, and if your baseline may be not very clear, are there any conversations about building capacity for having more data richness for those more poor fisheries?
That's a good question.
Did you want to address that?
Yeah, unfortunately, our hands are tied. BOEM's hands are tied. We depend on NOAA's data, and I don't want to point, they're our federal partners, so I'm not going to point and accuse or anything like that. We're using the best available data that we have. So VMS, VTR data are what we base our NEPA analyses on, recognizing, and we have it, in our analyses, that there are some data poor lobster, Jonah crab, some other species that don't have VMS data, or, have only just started reporting VMS data. So that is an issue. It's a great question. Unfortunately, I just don't have an answer at this time.
I would add from the state's perspective that one of the things that we've included along with BPU has included in their solicitation is a requirement for research dollars as part of the solicitation. So I think that there's been, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's in the tens of millions of dollars that have been committed to the research and monitoring initiative that the department is running in partnership with the board. And so through some of that work, we're establishing some new baseline for data that will be relevant up and down the coast for offshore wind.
Right, and I think that, to your point, the data that were collected were never intended to be used for this purpose, right? So, these data were never intended to figure out compensation models. So I think we're done, Tony. Is that one more? Oh, okay. Oh, Tony's question. All right.
Moderator's prerogative.
This is really great stuff. I guess I want to clarify something in my mind, which is the broad characterization is through the credit agreements, the community benefit agreements, through the RMI requirements, there are other information coming out to address fisheries concerns more directly. This is a very specific mitigation factor that's in the COP. So my question then, and to your point a little bit, there's a lot of other stuff going on that maybe might make the fishermen more comfortable negotiating a mitigation package if they feel like some of these other things are addressing some of their other concerns that don't fit in with the BOEM formula or the state formula, I'm guessing, right? So my question though is, I think Paul's question is, but what if, how much leeway is there for the specific fisheries that impacted that, or fishermen that are impacted, to come in and negotiate, saying, wait a second, it's not a question of just the direct impact with impacts and moving, but you know what, it questions my own business model. My boats no longer make sense. I'm not big enough to be adaptable to move other places. Is there negotiations that are very specific to individual fishermen? Say, it changes the nature of my business that might not, is there room to have that specific of a negotiation?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there's a really specific, example going on right now. The surf clam fishery incredibly vertically integrated fishing model, right? And so essentially they said, hey, instead of giving us this, specific compensation, we would like to have the conversation about a stock enhancement program, where we want to seed the offshore environment with clams, baby clam, mini ones, and we're going to grow them into big clams and catch them. And we're going to do that outside of the lease areas, because the lease areas are our prime clam grounds, and we want to do a stock enhancement program in lieu of compensation, right? So absolutely, that's on the table.
Again, kind of leads to my follow-up question. At some point, I'm interested in the way these mitigation plans might actually be changing the nature of fisheries and how they're going to operate.
Absolutely.
And how significant that will be regarding who's in the business,
Mm-hmm.
what's the nature of those businesses, so they were vertically integrated, and presumably it could have that kind of ripple effect at some point. And obviously, if you're a local community, you care more about whatever the fisheries that are operating in your community, so you might not care about these more macro questions.
Exactly. And I think that's, the states recognizing this is one piece. This is that kind of final step of compensation, financial compensation. But we would love to do everything to keep the fishing community fishing. I think that's the primary goal. Tony, I'm getting a request for one more question.
And actually, could I just jump
I mean,
in? one
okay,
sec?
sorry.
Yeah, I did want to mention also, there's, the gear compensation, there's things like that, transitioning into other, so adaptation, so that can be incorporated into the bid credit funds as well. So great point, yeah.
Allowed or not? Cutting. We're cutting it.
One last question?
Yes, one last.
Thank you. I was just wondering how stakeholder engagement is initiated. Like, how do you choose who to target and who will be the interested parties in these situations? Like, how do you find out who the fishers are and who the tribal partners are for each of these projects?
Jane, did you want to start that?
I guess I'll start on the fishing industry. So, I alluded to a higher level of engagement, certainly from the department's level, but our Marine Fisheries Administration has been engaged with the industry for, 50, 60 years, and so there is longstanding relationships and longstanding points of engagement from a resource management perspective. Certainly the same would be true for BOEM and for NOAA. So that's how the fishing industry stakeholders would be engaged from the state's perspective. I know that, and I won't speak for them from the developer's perspective, they have hired themselves individuals who are, what are they?
Fishing liaisons.
Fishing liaisons who go out and, like they always talk about, walking the docks and talking to individuals and engaging in that way. I think that would probably answer that question.
Yeah. Well, since we're short on time, we'll close it up. We heard from everything from the Miscellaneous Receipts Act to talcum powder on this panel. So please give a round of applause to our panelists here, and thanks to the Marco team.
So we are going to take a quick 10-minute break, since I asked that last question. So a 10-minute break, and we are going to reconvene at 2 to get our last panel.